sound like just two instruments. And then you can do the same thing with just the dyads as well. So playing just the say. So if we're playing just that, then all of a sudden like that's a sound that I don't hear. I mean, as played as often, you know, it's something that it's sort of it can have it can sound kind of modern in a lot of ways too, because you can add some tensions to chords that you might not be able to because they're spread out. The voicing is so spread out that you can essentially add these tensions. Don't sound as sort of egregious as they would necessarily if it was played all, you know, which is also a cool sound. But so that's sort of the end of what I think about with 4-note voicings, and 5 notes are sort of a little bit of the they're sort of the. It's sort of a middle ground. I mean, 5 notes voicings are very practical, but they're also generally I'm thinking of just adding a note to one of our existing 4-note voicings. So say that one of those, you know, the 1, 5, 7, 3 chords like we had earlier, adding say the sharp 11 on top, just seeing whatever notes we can essentially add to something like that. So playing that and playing that same chord in a different position on the neck, then we can add a different note to that. So there's the 13. Or if you want to add the 9 higher up. And then this can sort of be applied to, you know, to any of these. And this is something that, I mean, I know in Professor Lindsay's arranging class, that's a lot of, I mean, it's interesting to take that class as a guitar player because a lot of those voicings are, some of those drop 2s and things are verbatim guitar voicings. And when they talk about adding notes to those voicings, it gets kind of interesting. So to create a 6 chord with horns, you're not limited by the instruments. You can almost just think, what do I want to add? I want to add the 9 and maybe, you know, the sharp 11. So all of a sudden you're adding these notes, and it's just sort of how do I fit those in? That one I can actually do, but so I'm already getting ahead of myself to the 6-note chords, but maybe that's okay because we can talk about those. One of the main ways to create 6-note chords is to essentially do the same thing as the 5-note chords, but add 2 notes, obviously. So that's a perfect example of one. So that's our 5, 1, 3, 7 voicing for C major 7, and we're adding the 9 and the 13. And so this also leads me to something that's sort of I've addressed a little bit in the doctoral essay. That's that's largely, I think, some unexplored ground on guitar is playing hexatonic voicings. And by hexatonic, I mean 2 triads played simultaneously. And this is something I first, I mean, it shows up in classical music, you know, time and time again. Like some of these sounds, you know, that's 2 triads, a tritone apart. I forget if that's Firebird or Rite of Spring. That's in a Stravinsky piece, but essentially, like a lot of those voicings are hard to play on the guitar or even impossible at times. But I sort of got into exploring a little bit of this again after taking some lessons with Jerry Burgundy, who he's got a book on hexatonics, and he talks mostly about playing the single note sort of applications of these things. So playing. So that's playing C and D triads, and essentially coming up with almost a scale from the 2 triads. And there's a lot of things you can do in a linear way with those. Well, one thing Jerry Burgundy does is plays these things. He's a great piano player as well, and he plays these voicings on the piano, and he gets into some sounds that that are, you know, pretty obscure and far-reaching, and they're often close to say an altered chord or close to like a diminished dominant, but there's often one note that's sort of the odd note out. And say one that I got from him that was pretty interesting was to think of D flat minor and D minor, both triads played at the same time. So on the guitar, this is sort of something that's at the same time difficult and not easy, but self-explanatory, because in some ways it's like, well, we've only got 5 fingers, 6 strings. Like, how am I possibly going to play those 2 triads? And another way, once you've got 4 or 5 of the notes right, you're going to know whether the others are possible to add or not. It becomes kind of like a Sudoku, where you can really tell if you're completely wrong near the end. So that voicing and I think verbatim what he played, I believe, was the D minor triad. And it might have been up the octave. I mean, piano. It was easier to hear. So, and then the D flat minor above that. So, and I'd said, well, how would you use that in a practical setting? And he gave this sort of demonic smile and said and played. So that's one application. And I was prying him for more information on that, and he said, well, it sort of gets into density, and when you're trying to find a darker sound, and he said, some of these it turns into sort of like you've had a bad day, and that's what you're and so that wasn't necessarily the most practical way to explain that. But after I had sort of sat down with all these for a little longer, I sort of got into where one can play them on the guitar, and since there's only so many places you can play them on the guitar, they all start to sound. They all sort of take on a different sound. So I mean, one way is a G7. I mean, it would be like a diminished dominant, but that voicing has the A natural in it. So that's all of a sudden there'd be an extra note in the scale. It doesn't really fit that entirely, but you could play. I mean, when you try to voicelate them and have the resolve, all of a sudden you can sort of hear how playing more dense chords, so it's out of context. It might sound weird, doesn't really have the same effect, It's but so if you really, and that's something I've practiced with some of these. It's just trying to make sure there's a way of actually making something that's a more obscure voicing work. And so there's different. I mean, a couple of different inversions of just that one hexatonic voicing. So that's the exact same notes. And then this sort of gets into some interesting guitar things as well. We've got an open string. This would be unplayable otherwise. I mean, because to play, it'd have to be something like that. And with these, unless you're going to start using your nose, it gets difficult. But so something like that, all of a sudden, I hear that could still be the same G7 sound, but I hear that as more of a D minor sound all of a sudden. And you can try, trying different melodies or voicing different things. So if I think of, that other chord, all of a sudden we're in that realm, and it doesn't sound as, obscure, even though these are pretty weird ways to harmonize a jazz standard like that.